Historical ignorance of the Holocaust can lead to another Holocaust.
More than just the Holocaust, contemporary history is filled with events that must be known and remembered lest they be repeated.
The American Religious Town Hall is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Welcome to the American Religious Town Hall. I'm James Weingartner, sitting in for Pastor Lutz in this COVID edition. We are spaced out and fewer panelists in order to provide a little extra safety, but we're glad that you're with us, and we'd like you to know who your panelists are today. So we're going to begin to introduce ourselves with Canon John.
My name is Canon John Peterson. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church, canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
I'm Bishop Michael Olson. I'm the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
And I'm Tom Plumley. I'm down the street from Bishop Olson's Cathedral. I serve First Christian Church just off Sundance Square in downtown Fort Worth, Texas. Our congregation is a part of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ.
My name is Rabbi Dan Levin. I'm the senior rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be with you, gentlemen, and we're looking forward to a lively discussion today. And our subject is learning lessons from the Holocaust. Sometimes our breath is taken away by simply how fast history moves and how many earth-changing events are packed into each year. As an example, for children in elementary school today, the name Osama bin Laden is almost meaningless. And even for high schoolers, September 11th, 2001 is ancient history. Some of the evidence now coming out, however, is positively frightening in terms of the readiness of young Americans to apply the lessons of recent history to contemporary challenges the world faces. One example is a recent study of adults between the ages of 18 and 39, which revealed an amazing lack of understanding of the Holocaust in that age group. Only 64% of respondents even believe that study of that horrific time should be a compulsory part of education. When asked to name one of the 40,000 concentration camps or ghettos, 48% of the respondents could not name one. 56% of the young Americans surveyed were unable to identify what Auschwitz was. Large percentages could not recall the actual number of Jews, homosexuals, and others murdered in the Holocaust. A full 11% believed that Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. The figures were especially surprising in New York City, a city that's 10% Jewish. There are a full 20% of young adults believed Jews started the Holocaust. The questions for our panelists are about the source and effects of such ignorance and misinformation. Number one is, are the study's findings the result of poor education, deliberate misinformation from outside the formal education system, or simple disinterest within that age group? Two, does such widespread ignorance of the Holocaust increase the likelihood that something like that could happen again? And three, are other seminal events from the last century in danger of being forgotten or misinterpreted? And we'll begin our discussion today back with Dan, who started our point in the beginning.
Thank you. The Holocaust is not simply an event that hurt the Jewish people. It was an event that was a cataclysmic evil that descended on all of humanity. There are so many lessons that human beings need to learn from this hideous example of humanity's inhumanity to itself. The first is what happens when nationalism goes away into elements of chauvinism and bigotry. What happens when we allow for the scapegoating and the dehumanization of the other? What happens to a society when you allow the proliferation of propaganda and will for ignorance and misinformation and tribalism to infect in society? The lessons of the Holocaust are important to teach, not just because of the historicity of that tragedy, but because of the lessons it teaches as the antithesis to what a holy and a good society ought to be. And that's why it's so crucial that we teach it, because it is the example par excellence of what happens when the baseness of humanity ascends to power. There is an example I could share. There was a company that was formed in the late 19th century called J.A. Topf & Sons, and they manufactured equipment to have incinerators for trash and refuse and other kinds of things. And then during the 1920s, 1930s, they began to move into a new industry, which was crematoria. There was a German idea that it was much more dignified to cremate remains than to have them laid to rest whole. And they ended up in 1939 with a new client, which was Buchenwald, where they were asked to build industrial crematoria for a concentration camp, later a death camp. And J.A. Topf & Sons ended up being a company that built crematoria for many different concentration camps. So when we think about this company, sure, you can take a look at the owners of the company and say they did a terrible thing. But what about the people that designed these crematoria when they knew it was going to be multiple bodies in one space? What about the engineers that fabricated the steel? What about those that spent weeks at a time in the camps installing them? What about the people that processed the paperwork? What about the people who just looked on and saw what was being produced there? What about the people who moved into the abandoned apartments of Jews and others who were forced to move into ghettos and sat at their dinner tables and relaxed on their couches and went to bed in their beds? What about the people who just sat at their breakfast tables and read the newspapers of the latest atrocities and said, oh, isn't that terrible, and then went about their day? The lessons of the Holocaust are about what happens when a society is unwilling to stand up for what is true and right and good. And that's why it's so crucial that we continue to educate for that. In the same way that we continue to educate for the virtues of America through holidays like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Veterans Day, Memorial Day. These things memorialize values. They memorialize principles. They memorialize virtues. And in the same way, we want to memorialize how we respond to evil.
Thank you, Dan. Tom?
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I would not quibble with one thing that you said. I think that the study of history is an absolute must. One cannot consider oneself educated if one is not thoroughly informed about history. Yes, we have to catch up in science and technology and what's STEM all stand for?
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
And math, yes, we have to do that, but those are tools that are placed at the for the use of somebody that's driven by a philosophy that is driven by some historical reference, and therefore we must know history. With apologies to George Santayana, I saw a meme the other day that said, "Those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it," which is what Santayana said, and then went on to say, "Those who study history are doomed to watch them do it." I think, frankly, a perfect example in American history that needs to be repeated over and over again is the historical failure that we had at the violent end of Reconstruction. After the Civil War, you had this period of Reconstruction of the South, and that ended violently with the northern abandonment of the freedmen. That I think is a perfect example, because besides the plain harm that was done to people of color, to former slaves, through Jim Crow laws and the rise of the KKK and lynchings and so forth, that period also allowed for the creation of a myth. And the myth was that the Civil War, had been fought over states' rights, and that the Confederacy was a noble movement of white Christians, firm in their loyalty to their homeland and their fellow countrymen. All this forgetting that every one of the states' declarations of secession made it clear that it was about white supremacy and about the maintenance of slavery as an institution. And when we forget that, or when we refuse to teach, my elementary and secondary education did not touch that subject. Growing up not only in Texas but also in Missouri, it has taken this generation over 100 years after that Civil War, over 100 years after the end of Reconstruction, to begin to learn the real history of what happened in that era and how things were changed and the lasting effects of it. So yes, we've got to know history. We have to make sure that our children know it as well.
Well, it's a very powerful and very important question, especially in light of the immense human aberration of the Holocaust that people are forgetting. And I think a big question is that are we teaching history? I don't know if we teach history as well as we used to. History always involves valuation, but I'm afraid that the revisionism that in some ways is an authentic critique of the past and of history, as it's been told, has replaced history as far as dates and facts which people can place value upon. I think especially what's passing away is a generation of survivors. All right, and I think we've heard the narrative of survivors so long that as that generation is passing away, my concern is that people just don't want to be bothered with that anymore because the survivors aren't here to tell their story. And so it becomes just framed as something that happened back then, and we've got more things to move out upon. But that's precisely the recipe of these types of things, of something like the Holocaust, where you can replace history, the story, facts, with a convenient explanation that puts it away and puts it out of our sight, and we can move on. But we move on not with a sense of a mission to correct what's gone before, to make restitution, to redeem what's been in our past and is still always seminally present in our current events. And And the truth is that simply that so much evil is done, as has been said, is not so much those who've done the evil, but our friends and the good people who do nothing in face of that. I think that our responsibility is, first of all, to care. Secondly, it's we cannot simply sit by disinterestedly as saying, well, this really doesn't affect most people, and we can explain our indifference away. The connection of indifference comes out of ignorance and a willful ignorance where we don't want to be inconvenienced by the plight of others or the plight of anyone in society.
John?
Wow. Just before I started to put my thoughts on paper about the Holocaust history lessons, I called my daughter Emily, who is a Palestinian by birth, whom we adopted when we lived for 12 years in Jerusalem. I told my daughter the topic that I was going to be working on, and I was quite surprised by my millennial daughter's response. Listen to her words. Quote, "The only thing worse than ignorance about the Holocaust are Holocaust deniers." A Palestinian by birth, with all that's gone on, could say the only thing worse than ignorance about the Holocaust are Holocaust deniers. And I suspect, Michael, what you have just said is very true. When those people are dying, the Holocaust survivors are dying, and that story is not being told firsthand anymore. It even makes it easier for the deniers to be able to get their story across. As false as it is, one of the problems, we no longer have that firsthand knowledge. We see this, for example, also with the Armenian genocide. They're basically dead. And the story is now being rewritten about the Armenian Holocaust. And so, how do we keep that story alive? How is that story told so that people will not forget? And, might I say, so that the deniers don't have the upper hand. Now, I read a statistic, and I cannot remember all the details, but many states in the United States have actually instructed schools to teach about the Holocaust. Not all the states have adopted that program, but many of the states have. And the problem here, and I think that Dan might want to speak about that because we've spoken earlier today about it. The problem is that they attach it to other subjects that are being discussed, economics or social studies or something like that, and really do not get into the nuts and bolts of the Holocaust. They don't get into the nuts and bolts about those people who built the crematoriums. And so we are living in a situation that indeed, and it's true, that many people have forgotten or do not know that the Nazis actually believed that Germans were racially superior, which was one of the forms of justification. We have forgotten that during the Holocaust, it was not only the Jews who were brought to the crematoriums, but also the gypsies, the disabled, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. We've forgotten that story and how important it is to remember that story so that we do not forget. And a case in perfect in point about who did forget was in Rwanda and the horrific genocide that took place in Rwanda. And I saw that firsthand.
Beautiful, thank you. I love Tom's question. Can we be considered educated if we don't understand history, not just be taught it, not just have lip service to it, but really understand it. It's a very important question. A mathematical education that doesn't include history isn't education. Yes?
Well, and we have to learn to feel with
Empathy.
people who are in those circumstances, or we are unable to act in our day. Perfect example, there are still 500 children kidnapped, separated from their parents by the United States, and we are not doing anything to get them back with their parents. That's all of us.
Yeah. We'll be back for the summation after this break.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you and today's closing statements.
Welcome back. We're glad that you're watching, and we're glad that you have more options now than just on television broadcasts. You can watch this on the YouTube, and we're willing and wanting to hear from you. And Pastor Lutz reads whatever you send us, and we'd love to make programs that are relevant and appropriate to you. And now we're really excited about the summations of this important topic, beginning with Canon John Peterson.
Thank you. I mentioned that one of the bases for the what happened in Germany was that the Nazis believed that Germans were radically superior, that Jews were inferior, and they wanted to create a pure state. How oftentimes do we do that today? In our own place where we live, how oftentimes do we, to make ourselves feel more important, demote someone else? In our own communities, where we live, how sensitive are we to those people who we see to be inferior? And I think that that is an issue that comes out of this lesson that we have to face. Our democracy is fragile, and human rights are easily weakened and demolished. What happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany is one of the worst atrocities. But being a Nazi denier or a Holocaust denier is even worse. I saw firsthand the horrors of Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda. And although I did not see earlier ones, boy, we must take note and to bring it home as well.
Thank you. Tom?
I mentioned the creation of myths. Mythology is all around us, and it comes with the refusal to set standards for truth-telling. We must require people to tell the truth in public space. That is increasingly difficult with so many, with the democratization of information sources. But we have to, as a society, as a world, we have to continue to require that those who speak for us tell the truth. And when they do not, we must call them on it.
Thank you, Tom.
I think part of the reason why it's so important for us to study that history is because we do get lost in our own milieu, and we need guardrails to remind us of when we're going. I think we forget about how fast Nazi Germany descended into that evil. It was less than 10 years from a functional democracy to a totalitarian evil the world has never seen. And I think that when you read things like Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and you see the echoes of things in our own day and age, it reminds you why it's so important to know that history. Because if you don't know that history, then you don't know when you're going off the rails in your own time.
Thank you, Dan.
The Greek word for truth is aletheia, which literally is translated as not forgetting. I think that, that's really an apt description, and I like that definition very much because it shows us that truth is something we receive and not something that we make and fashion of our own doing. And the more we retell the story, and as we hear the stories told to us through history, through experiences shared, the more we understand and grow and are able to recognize what's gone before us in the current and present day. I think that we have to remember, and even more so not forget, that in the case of the Holocaust, you had one of the highest cultures in Europe, in the arts and philosophy and science and mathematics descend into this sort of madness precisely because someone was able to play upon fears. Fears that can either be transformed into evil and anger and rage and violence, or fears that can be redeemed through community, through knowledge, through peace, and ultimately through the fullness of the truth.
Thank you, Bishop. The charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy, and the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. Now, friends, until next week at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.